My name is Dr. Jonathan Gore. I am a professor in the psychology department at EKU and also the director of undergraduate research for the university.
Hi, everyone. I'm Dr. Shirley O'Brien, and I am a foundation professor from the Department of Occupational Science and Occupational Therapy, and I serve as the co-coordinator of our faculty innovators here at Eastern Kentucky University.
So Shirley and I have been trying to rabble-rouse a lot a couple years during Scholars Week to see how we can get some faculty exchange, sort of interdisciplinary faculty exchanges happening. And one of the ways that we wanted to talk about that and try that out this time was to create sort of a town hall situation where people can share their tips for how they were able to, or maybe some roadblocks they ran into during the past year, where we had a lot of restrictions in place and some people were able to keep going with their research and scholarship with very few hiccups, and other people were like, I'm on complete shutdown now. So I wanted us to just get some good minds together and think about what are some ways that we could share our tips for how we got through this past year and what our successes were there, and maybe some ways to share some good information here. So I put the questions in the chat. Now, those of you joining us live on YouTube may not be able to see that, but we wanted to know how well you're able to maintain your typical level of scholarship in several different areas. And we can go through those one at a time, or if you're looking at these different areas and thinking about, oh yeah, I did well here, but not so well here, you're welcome to chime in. So you can chime in on the YouTube, or you can chime in on the chat in this Zoom session. So there's really 8 different areas that we wanted to talk about. So the first area was just developing project ideas. We know that can take a really long time. Okay, great. So we copied those over to YouTube so you can answer those as well. So developing projects is just coming up with the idea of the project. Number 2 would be writing. Number 3 would be publishing. Number 4, presenting. Number 5, your research teams and mentorships, being able to supervise students, for example. 6 would be interdisciplinary partnerships. 7 would be your grant writing or submission. And 8 would be a scholarship of teaching and learning, where you would be able to look at some SOTL research based on pandemic era teaching practices. Now, of course, different disciplines and different fields require different processes during the research and scholarship machine of sorts. So if you wanted to talk about things like data collection or analysis or things like that, we could also do that there. But think about your whole process of scholarship. What things were able to go just as planned? What things were really just sort of you had to put the brakes on or had to really transition? And what were things that maybe you even figured out how to do it even better because of the restrictions that were put in place? So we'll open it up to whoever is present, and we'll see what you have to say about things that went well, and maybe some things that didn't go well, so we could share some of our own tips.
And also the opportunities. Sometimes it's reframing. We get real traditional in academia about what is our scholarship. So, were there any reframing opportunities for you? So join us. Let's hear what you have to say.
I know for me, I definitely have a very active program of research in a variety of areas. I also do a lot of mentoring for students. And I would say that the thing that definitely was put on hold was the data collection for me. That I reduced the number of projects that I did some data collection on. And there's one project that I just completely had to put on hold, mostly because it involved getting some saliva samples from from live participants that I would run to look at testosterone levels. And I was just like, there is absolutely no way anyone's going to let me have people spitting in There's no way that's happened. So I just had to put that on hold and focus on some of the more online data collection that I was doing. But a good amount of what I was able to work off of were data sets that I had already collected, and I just set aside because I didn't have enough time to analyze them. So I did have some time to look at sort of my backlog of data collection. So I guess.
I think that's a really good point, John, just about thinking how we were able to shape the opportunity. For me it was, I got 3 articles done with students or a colleague from here from Kentucky who was working on something on leadership. And it just fell into my lap because it framed all 3 of them from a COVID perspective.
Mm-hmm.
And we just launched right into it. So it was cool. The one project was a student master's project. Another one was just as we were getting started, the student said, I've got some ideas about population-based roles for occupational therapists. I'd like to do this instead of the real project in your class. I was like, you go for it. And, and once I saw the draft, we were ready to go.
Yeah.
So, again, being open to that opportunity, being open to flexibility in reviewing student work or collaborative work that we could work together as students, as partners or partners, interdisciplinary. The other piece with that, though, is just being open to the options that could have been out there. I saw a lot of people freeze because they were trying to figure out, how do I begin teaching in this new environment? Luckily, I know how to teach online, and I've been doing that now for 15 years. That's my problem. So I think that's what allowed me to continue my productivity, coaching others.
Yeah. I mean, I think it did open up a lot of opportunities, and maybe for some fields more so than others. My area is social psychology, social and cultural psychology, and say that the year 2020 just overall was just a treasure trove of social and cultural psychological phenomena that I could base the rest of my career on just trying to explain all the stuff that happened that year. I mean, that is so much going on there that it's going to take years and years to try to sort out. But I mean, most of our fields would have something to say about just what happened during the pandemic, both directly in terms of the pandemic, but also indirectly in terms of these social, political, societal responses to the pandemic. I think we would all, if we thought about our own programs of research and our own theories and thought about, all right, if I were to branch that into a pandemic area, direction, how would I be able to explain some of the things that happened in the past year from my own area of expertise, even though I wasn't planning on doing that. So we do have a comment from Rusty saying more collaboration and identifying committed team members. I'm not quite clear if that was something that went well or something that didn't go well, but you might be able to clarify that if during the pandemic, if you were able to identify committed team members better, or if you were able to, or had some issues trying to figure that out. I know that could really go either way.
Very much so. Oh, and also the, again, with occupational science and occupational therapy, we're a nice blend of social science along with then the hard sciences. But, I tend to go on the social science side. Looking at data differently. I didn't think about how to collect things from social media before. I almost pursued it. And all of a sudden, that was our only avenue for data collection. Looking at surveys, paper surveys, we're not going to touch anything. So, I learned Qualtrics during this. So opportunities again for looking at alternative data collection methods, I think is what I've seen with my colleagues.
Mhm. Yeah, and I think so many of us being routed into online teaching, some people jumping into that and some people being dragged into that. I think that's a similar thing with research, but I think as people are able to navigate sort of these online teaching platforms, it might be more inclined to say, all right, well, maybe I'm ready to tackle some of these online research platforms and data collection platforms. And a lot of them are very straightforward. I can say for sure, if you're a survey researcher in any way, qualitative researcher in any way, these online platforms like Qualtrics are very suitable for collecting data that you might not necessarily need to do your normal way of doing things anymore.
But, you know, and I was just talking with a student who was looking at thesis topics, and she's like, I just want to sit on Twitter and analyze disability rights perspectives about getting vaccines. And I thought, I would have never thought of that as a topic. I would have shied away from going onto Twitter as an analysis tool, you
Yeah.
know. So I think it's given us opportunities.
Yeah.
What about publishing, John? Have you seen any changes with publishing and or journal articles, books?
Well, I'm an editor of a student journal, and I would say that our submissions were less, but it didn't necessarily see any hiccups in terms of making sure they got their articles reviewed, making sure they got feedback, make sure they revised it, and make sure they eventually got accepted. For my personal, I've also reviewed a couple journal articles. And I would say that overall, a lot of things have slowed down a little bit. So the peer review process has probably slowed down quite a bit because a lot of people, when they get a request for a peer review, is they'll sit on it until the day it's due or the day it's due. And I think that a lot more people were doing that and just delaying their review because they had a lot of other things going on. So it got pushed to the back burner a lot more so than usual. So that delays the process. So I think the actual getting it accepted. But in terms of getting manuscripts prepared for publication, I would say that I had a very unproductive fall because I was just trying to make sure that everything was in place. But I was also homeschooling 2 kids, and writing in a home setting with a 9-year-old and a 5-year-old is pretty much impossible. It's just that kind of immersion that you need to put yourself into to write at that level is just not possible. And so this semester, I was also kind of on that slowdown, and then our kids went back to school. And all of a sudden I had that time that opened up again. I wasn't homeschooling anymore. So I had that time opened up again to write. And I was able to just crank out several manuscripts that were sort of in some level of completion, but I was able to wrap those up and send them out, which was a nice feeling. So there's lots of elements for publishing. But I would say that the writing side of publishing was definitely a slowdown for me until recently. And a lot of that had to do with taking on the homeschooling of my kids. So,
and I think that's pretty typical, at least in reading the Chronicle and women in scholarship. Women have been talking about this incessantly. They don't have time. Doing the virtual school, everybody's on a computer. Mom having to give up a lot of their roles. And it seems to be more of, and I appreciate that you said, you were homeschooling and, you're an equal partner and, you're participating, but that wasn't always true for a lot of female academics. And we're very stressed. So that whole idea of writing and then getting reviews in for peer review have been a challenge. I know one of the journals that I was looking to try to help a colleague submit to was a qualitative journal, said we are now 3 years behind with submissions or review.
Yeah.
So when you think about that, 3 years to sit in a pool, I'm going
Mhm.
there. And her question was, well, where else should I go? And I'm like, well, let's start playing, let's look for an alternative way to
Mhm. Mhm.
and I think that's the other piece I've seen. We have the Journal of Occupational Therapy Education here,
Mhm.
housed in my department, and I know that submissions have been up. People have been really trying to use this as a time, but again, making sure that we can get quality reviews, peer reviews, is an important part. Not just producing, the journal. So
Mhm.
kind of a mixed bag in there.
Yeah.
Anything,
One-
any of our participants, do you want to chime in?
I had a very similar experience to Dr. Gore, that we had, papers that normally in journals that I've submitted before, it had been 2 or 3 months, and I had a couple that one sit for like 11 months and the other sit for and it had nothing to do with the paper itself, because eventually it got accepted anyway, but it's just like the length of the process, and that can affect, especially maybe junior faculty, or even students. I had one of the students co-authors was applying for PhD programs, and hopefully PhD, the receivers of it, if it says revise and resubmit, is it good enough to make a strong case for the student? But at the same time, that if that article would have been accepted a couple months before or 3 months before, it would maybe have made a difference for that student application being published as opposed to revise and resubmit. So I guess some of those issues may have an disproportional impact on younger getting started, either faculty or students.
Yeah, big time. And that's just something that I think admissions committees are going to have to factor in. Promotion tenure committees are going to have to factor in, and we'll just have to see what kind of leeway people are willing to provide. I don't know, because if I know what Shirley's talking about is absolutely true. If people don't factor that in, there's going to be a considerable gender disparity and probably multiple other disparities as a result of people having to respond to non-academic and non-professional needs that sprang up during the pandemic. And that's not good. I mean, we do not want that kind of situation in academia at all, or in these professional fields. So that's just something that we're going to have to see what we're actually dealing with once we do those reviews. But
Well, what about SOTL research? Because this is such a unique time. Has anybody ventured into looking at, differences in teaching online, any types of tools that they're using, anything related to the differences that we may have seen? Anyone captured this as an opportunity?
Yes, so in my professional learning community, there is a team that includes some OT faculty and other faculty that are looking at this specifically. And it was really interesting. They are looking, so in this case, the result was no differences, which for them was a big win because the comparison was in-person versus online. So just showing that online was equally as effective, that the in-person was the win, right? Like they weren't looking for online being better, was just to not be different. And I think there is so much potential also that we are maybe missing opportunities with Blackboard or any other system that people use, because you can export so many data analytics from Blackboard, from how many clicks, how many views, how many, like Blackboard can record all of that passively, and you could record it for every single student in the class passively. Now, I don't know how that will apply in terms of IRB issues, but it sounds like a potential for a lot of data being collected really easily.
mm-hmm.
Well, and because it's there, Sarah, I think that's a good point. From an IRB standpoint, and John, correct me if I'm wrong, but that would be directory data that's just there. And, and it's a part of the system so that we could analyze it and better understand, well, which of the folders do people click on, how often and, during what time periods do they access the readings or the videos?
Yeah, that would count as, I haven't been on the IRB for a couple of years, but I think it's category 1, where it's practices that are basically existing educational practices. And of course, you still need to submit an IRB if you decide to publish what you learned. But Sarah's right. I mean, you are collecting data, you have access to data, even if you don't realize you have the data. So that's a nice thing about Blackboard and various other things like website use or as we talked about, social media. There are data sources out there, even if you are not actively collecting data, that you can really capitalize upon. Just make sure that you're checking with the IRB to make sure that whatever project idea you have in mind, you want to make sure you're doing the right forms and submitting the right paperwork for it. But yeah, that I think going back to something Shirley said was, I mean, I think our students actually have a really good production of ideas. They don't know how to do the studies necessarily, but most of the projects that have been picked up, that I had something to do with, that got picked up in sort of like mass media, were student projects, because they had their pulse on what do people are interested in and what's sort of this topic that people really want to learn more about, because they want to learn more about it. So I think this can also apply to SOTL, is our students, we might be able to just ask them in a chat or some discussion function, just like, what do you think about how we've been doing this as opposed to how we used to be doing this? And that could in itself be a project, and asking them qualitatively, what do you like about this and what don't you like about this? And that in itself is a project. And you could also be looking at how you've changed your in-person classes to online classes, and just look at the general, how well are they doing? How well are they keeping up with the assignments? How well are they understanding material? Did you have to change any of the ways that you evaluated their assignments in some way? Any change that you did is a potential for a SOTL project. So that's just something to keep in mind, that even if you have these programs of research that were put on hold, you basically were forced into a
Incubator.
Almost like 2-condition type of design, where it's like you got online and you got in-person data now. And even if you don't publish it, you can be informed by it.
Well, and I think that can help us improve our teaching. I mean, I looked at it in the fall about different skill sets that I had helped students develop. And, I was struggling as I was doing it, keeping a journal, but then also when I got my course evaluations, those were the things students commented most frequently on.
Mm-hmm.
And if I were to compare last year's course evals to the year before, I'm sure I will see a difference, because those would not have been things that even came up.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Giving me an idea for project. Ooh.
Yeah, there we go. There's always something to look at. There's data everywhere.
What about research teams and mentorships? How has that worked for everyone within this last year? What's happened during the pandemic with research teams? Have they worked or not? Personally, I can tell you, I've been fortunate. It's worked pretty well for me. It was just scheduling virtual meetings and really working together. But I know others, said not so much. So I don't know what went on. Trina, I know Trina's here from the library, and I'd be interested to hear, like, what your thoughts are about that.
Could you repeat the exact question? I'm sorry.
I know you are. No, I was thinking about, like, what have you seen with research teams and mentorship? How are we working together and or using librarians? Are we doing that?
If we're doing it, it's not visible right now. Most of our research assistants has shifted to Zoom, like a lot of other things, but I don't think that we have seen a lot of teams access that as a resource. And more specifically, I don't think that we've seen kind of faculty student teams access that as a resource. And maybe that's because we don't advertise it in those ways. The libraries is really good about reaching out to students and, the whole "you belong here, ask us," but I don't know how often we make the connection visible and deliberate and intentional when it's like, and that's not just for your quote unquote essay paper in your this class or that class, that's for these broader research opportunities as well. And maybe that's a missed opportunity on our part, and we need to be more deliberate in reaching out to those teams through Dr. Gore and others who know where they are and how they exist. I mean, it would be amazing to maybe give research teams that are doing heavier reviews of the literature and that kind of library style research, give them a targeted librarian and be like, here's a librarian for your team on call. That's a really excellent idea. So I don't know that we've seen a change in COVID, because I don't know if we were really deliberate prior to COVID. So that's a really interesting question. I'm glad you asked it, because now it's got me thinking about what we can do. Because I think we know we're here for those teams, but do those teams know we're here for them in that same way? And I think so often the students kind of separate that idea of like what I do on my own in a classroom for a paper that I'm turning in for an individual instructor. Okay, yeah, I might make a research appointment for that. But when they see themselves as a member of this research team with a faculty member, do they still recognize that those things can still happen in that way? And I'm not sure. I think they rely so heavily on the faculty member and or don't want to reveal like, oh, I really feel like I could get help from someone else in that way. Yeah. So it's an interesting question, interesting opportunity.
So I think there's two ways you could advertise. One is, once you got those materials in place, or with flyers, whatever you decide, a video or something like that, I have a list of sort of what I call my usual suspects, which is the people who mentor frequently in terms of honors and McNair and senior thesis and all those kinds of things. And I could just send it to them and say, just so you know, this resource is always available anytime your lab is doing anything, and they maybe could schedule a lab meeting that would happen at the library, or a librarian could come to one of their lab meetings. And then there's also several courses, and I teach one of them, where the students, sort of like capstone courses or thesis courses, where it's like, yeah, you guys should never feel like, you're all by yourself on this project. So you should, first of all, have a decent mentor. But if that mentor is, not necessarily all that responsive, you have these other resources that are in place that could help move you along on this project that has a pretty tight deadline. So I teach a couple courses actually in the psychology department and for McNair that would be great to just talk more about this resource, or even have sort of a guest speaker come in, or a video to show. But there's absolutely a need for, and some places where we could do those advertisements for that resource. And that's just a general issue that I think is happening across the board. Is EDU has many, many, many resources, and as we want to make sure that everyone's aware of those resources, and that's not always the case. So I have to keep telling people, I have lots of money and I want to go broke by the end of the fiscal period, so please take my money. And I just,
One, thinking about money, it might be interesting as we see an encouragement and increase possibly of student groups and students who are, tied in with faculty, maybe developing grant proposals. I know that's something we're talking about. Adding a librarian to a grant proposal team looks good on the other side, right? So we will be there for those type of things too. And one thing, as we're talking about this too, I think it would be interesting for students and the faculty members to have a conversation about research in those projects with the librarian, because I think so often students are, even in the upper levels where they're kind of engaging in this more in-depth research, I think they're still learning the language of research within a particular discipline, because it does vary. I know when I get a student who is doing research within like chemistry realm, I have to really stop and think about that, because that's not my usual research language and it's a different approach. And so I think students to see how a chemist would approach a review of the literature through database searches and how they would have that conversation and what language they would use would be really interesting. Because so often for me, as someone who doesn't necessarily operate in that, say, for example, the chemistry realm, I'm like, well, what's the name of that compound? Okay, let's look for that. But chemists would know how to back up from that in a different way and have different language. So
I run into that so much with the McNair course where I got biology students and chemistry students, and I'm just like, I'm so sorry that I have to defer so much to your mentor to be able to say whether this looks right or not. But I'm just like, that is so just outside of my wheelhouse. But you do your best. But yeah, I would love to talk more about having a regular sort of appearance from the library, someone from the library in those in my two courses at least. And then we can definitely get it out there to the other courses and faculty mentors as well.
And Trina, you brought up an important piece about grants. So, how have grants, have they opened up? Do we have options? What have we seen with faculty applying for, participating in grants, and or did they have to give back money, because of the pandemic? I don't know. John, have you seen anything like that? I know with the grant I'm involved with Myra Beth, we were really creative and moved virtually, and we were comfortable just moving that forward. And what it is, we've gotten some great ideas out of here going, wow, this would not have been something we would have done had we been pushed, because we're very traditional in what we do. Social skills groups, and we want to keep them, I guess more measurable, because there are things we're having to look at different measures, but so we didn't have to turn the money back, but I don't know that granting agencies, I don't know what's really happened. I've not looked at that.
And there's a variety of who the granting agencies are and what they're looking for. But speaking of Myra Beth, there's another grant that that a student had an idea for that she looked into, and they got the grant approved. And I think a lot of this is just kind of like there's lots of resources, but people don't know about them. I mean, if you don't have time to write a grant application, then if less people have the time to do that, that means that it's less competitive, which means you're more likely to get it if you do the application. So, I mean, the economy is similar in the sense that there are times when to, invest during a crisis and at times to invest in other things when it's doing well. And it's the same with this. It's just like with grants, this is probably not the time to do some aspects of research. But like kind of like my saliva test thing, it's just like, don't do that. But this would be a decent time to be writing a grant for maybe that project or a different project, because there's sort of a general slowdown for lots of people. And having written grants, I know that grants are a massive investment of your time, with a fairly high risk that it might just get sent back to you rejected. But I can say that despite the work that is still going to have to go into it, I would assume that the risk is slightly lower now of it getting rejected because of this overall slowdown. So now would be the time to start thinking about potential grant ideas. And I know for sure, just for undergrad research, if there's any undergrad students watching this at any point, that I still have money and I still have grants available, and you should start thinking about some real creative projects that you might need supplies for, or conferences you might want to submit to, because they're
Come get Dr. Gore's money, folks. Come.
that is my yearly plea.
And I will also say, and I can't point to them exactly, and I don't know how much of it is trade-off in terms of like, well, okay, these grants aren't out there, so these have taken their place, but I have seen an increase, I feel like recently, in grants out there that are kind of tied to what we've learned from shifting into pandemic mode, right? Particularly in higher ed, seeing some of those come out of the library world recently. And then in addition to that, thinking about the other things that are going on around us, seeing a lot of grants that are focused on equity, diversity, and inclusion. And then also grants that are looking at that in conjunction with changes to the way we work because of the pandemic. Because I think we have seen that this, much like everything else in our world, impacts certain populations and demographics in much harsher ways than others. So.
Yeah. And I would also add to that, there's not just a call for pandemic related scholarship just because it's interesting. There really is a duty, I think, of universities and colleges and places where we do scholarship to provide those answers to those questions that people have, because people are going to have the questions anyway, and you want to think about what is the alternative source to answer those questions. And if that doesn't make you cringe, you know that a lot of sources of information are wrong and are getting out there pretty well, and we need to counter that wave of misinformation with good information. If we don't provide the good information, people are just going to look for answers to their questions regardless, and they're going to stumble upon the bad information. So not only should we consider these sort of pandemic related questions and answers that we can provide in our expertise, but just for the sake of doing something, or for the sake of just it's interesting, but think about, there is a gap in our understanding of what's happening there, and we are responsible. We are the ones who are supposed to be filling that in, and not someone else. So we really should take that responsibility.
And along those lines, and then also the questions of access and equity. I think that this has really highlighted how the lack of access to strong information, and not just access in terms of do I have a way behind that paywall for that research, but also access in terms of the way we communicate about science and the language we use and how accessible that language is to your general population. I think that COVID and disinformation and lack of access and ability to understand in clear language, that's really highlighted those issues. They've always been there. They've always been a problem, but I think it's made them visible in a way that they might not have been as visible in the past. And so there's clearly a lot of room for research and action in that area, I think.
And it really reinforces that idea of having a team, and in particular, interdisciplinary partners, because, just as John was saying, these societal issues are going to happen. Pandemics come and go. We have hurricanes, we have floods. We just saw the flooding in Eastern Kentucky. Again, there are health related issues, there are safety related issues. there are basic welfare issues that if you really look at it, this is ripe to study. This is ripe to come together. And we're but a university. Can you do that? We have experts in every one of the fields. I know John and I have tried to start this conversation several ways of trying to get people to sit around a table and say, oh, we're going to pick an issue and, I'm going to represent healthcare. I'm going to represent justice and safety or, whatever. And, we're still trying to foster that collaboration. And I think that's where the interdisciplinary partnerships really do come from. And so if we think more like that as academics, that's what adds to our value. It reinforces our gen ed perspective. To me, it just all ties into being a good citizen. And so we can study those pieces. And I think we are really ripe to move this forward.
I want to add to that idea of the teams and something that I've been thinking a lot this last year. So in my lab, I have different students at different levels, right? So I try to scale it. So I have like the the first semester student who knows nothing. And then I have, 1 semester, 2 semesters, all the way to graduate students. And I try to give graduate students more like mentorship roles and stuff, right? And when they are physically in the Keith building, this seems to happen, like I don't do much effort and it happens, right? Like I come back and they are making popcorn or whatever, and these things happen. And now this semester has been almost impossible, in which all the emails were like directional to me. So how do you, I don't know, create a new experiment? And it was also all me, one student. There was no trickle down where the more senior students were helping the more junior students. All of those informal communications that normally happen were not happening at all. And I wonder if these, in my lab, when you physically put them together, they happen. And I wonder if, in thinking about these teams at the university and this interdisciplinary, if there is a place where we can put researchers together for these things to happen, right? And some of these may be formal, like, okay, let's think about a grant and write it, but there may be maybe also informal avenues in which sometimes just by, being somewhere, some of these things, get going in your head and you start thinking about these ideas.
I mean, the place that really pops in my head first is Fictal. Like, let's just do a lunch, even if it's just once a week. But I'm thinking just let's have our lunches in Fictal. And it doesn't necessarily always have to be, talking shop there, but that is the place, I think, to think about where we could meet and discuss those kinds of ideas. It's a big space. So that would be perfectly easy enough. And there's lots of places we could meet sort of informally to discuss these things. And that could be once a week, once a month. It would still be more than what's happening now. So it's more of a matter of who's going to take the lead and when is it going to be and what are we going to be doing. But I think that just getting people in the same room is kind of key for that. And it's just a matter of everyone agrees we're just going to set our time aside and do this thing. And we might just be chatting for 80% of that time, and we might hit on something that really catches fire, and next time we'll talk about it some more. But if we're not doing those informal gatherings regularly, I think that that's the mechanism that these kinds of partnerships happen. But
see, and I agree with you, John. I think that's where the pandemic has really pushed us backward, because you reach out only to the people you know.
mm-hmm.
We're not bringing people together, and it's that community that, just really fostering that. Maybe that is an idea that we use for the Faculty Center for Teaching and Learning. And, we'll say the first Monday of the month, I know Senate meets, well, that's when the research group meet, or
Mhm.
brown bag, bring your own lunch. We're here to just talk about ideas.
Mhm.
I think what's happened though is that many people have had their schedules packed
Mhm.
over this pandemic. And so it's not been as conducive to doing that. So maybe that's a plan for our fall, that we, John and I will call at least the group together to start, and then hand the torch over to say, okay, who wants to continue this? That may be a really great idea.
Yeah. We're gonna see what happens. If it's just 3 or 4 people to start, then that's a heck of a research team, honestly. That's a
It is.
so
It really is. It really is.
yeah.
Well, I know one of the topics we want to talk about is presenting. And speaking of that, I need to go to present at another conference. So I'm going to leave John in charge. And I thank you all for being here today. And I hope that you'll get inspired by this. So I'm off to an Inspire conference, Inspire AOTA this year. So stay well.
All right, see ya. So presenting. I think that presenting is a little bit tricky because most of the time when I've been presenting professionally, it's been, hey, I get to go to, Asheville, or I get to go to Savannah, or I get to go to Miami or whatever. And that's where I'll present. And really most of everything that we've been doing has been kind of from our own, living room or our own office or whatever. So it's not quite as fun as the normal presentations go, but there are a significant amount of online opportunities to do conferences. And if those of you watching this, if you're not sure what those opportunities are, definitely look into it. And there's lots of conferences that the registration fees are lower because you're not having to pay for so many other things at the conference location. So you might be able to present something professionally at a very good conference, but it would be lower cost. So if you're not sure where to look, just reach out to anyone on this call. We could definitely help you find some of those conference opportunities. But one thing I will do is just pitch that we are doing a faculty symposium series during Scholars Week. This is every day this week from 3:30 to 5. So you want to check the Scholars Week schedule for what those topics are. We had a great one yesterday. All of these have been they're peer-reviewed presentations, very similar to a conference, but we have a great series coming up today and every other day this week from 3:30 to 5, and we'll be over Zoom. And it's something that we hope to do every year for Scholars Week, where especially junior faculty get a chance to present some of their work to the university community. And I think that surely is in my goal of trying to get some of these interdisciplinary conversations going would really kind of go into motion pretty well from those symposia. So we really hope to expand on that in the coming years. Are there any other ideas or tips or questions or problems that anyone had during this past year that you'd like to talk about? Well, because there is no more chiming in, I think we'll probably end this session a little bit early. Just know that these kinds of conversations can continue. We will build upon some of the ideas that we did here. And you can see just how easy it is to get some ideas going just from a fairly small handful of really great thinkers and really passionate academics just getting together and thinking about some of these ideas. So I appreciate you all listening. I appreciate you just participating, and please be on the lookout for some more opportunities in the future that hopefully will take place in person, and we can maybe have some lunch together and discuss more ideas. Thanks, everybody.